Gyfeillion, noswaith dda, mae newydd droi 5 o'r gloch, felly da ni am gychwyn ar y drydedd seminar yng nghyfres y gwanwyn o seminarau Canolfan Uwchhyfryddiau Cymreig a Cheltaeth Prifysgol Cymru. Very warm welcome as we start our third in the spring series of the seminars of the University of Wales Centre for Advanced Welsh and Celtic Studies. Sorry, I was just letting a few people in as I was pressing the buttons there. So it's a great pleasure for me this evening to pass you directly to Professor John Koch, John Koch, who is going to be presenting our speaker this evening, Professor Johan Ling. Felly draw atoch chi, John.
Yeah, diolch yn fawr, Helen. Johan Ling is Professor of Archaeology in the Department of Historical Studies at the University of Gothenburg in Sweden, which is an acknowledged world leader in the field of European prehistory. Johan is also the director of the Swedish Rock Art Research Archives, which oversees one of the most important bodies of European prehistoric art. Johan is a specialist in Bronze Age archaeology. His internationally recognized contributions include work on the provenancing of ancient metal, which we'll be talking about today, dating and interpreting of Scandinavian rock art, Bronze Age maritime trade, and cross-cultural aspects of Bronze Age maritime trade. Johan and I have been in collaborative ventures together with our institution since about 2015. These include a 2017 international workshop entitled Rock Art and Metal Late Bronze Age Contact Between Scandinavia and the Iberian Peninsula, which was supported by Sweden's Riksbank Fund. That led to a 4-year project, which we're now in the middle of, entitled Rock Art Atlantic Europe Words and Warriors, acronym RAW. And this is funded by the Swedish Research Council. Johan is the principal investigator of that project, which is now about at its midpoint with 2 years yet to run. Johan Ling's topic today is Welsh copper in Scandinavian forms, Great Orme's impact on the Scandinavian bronzes, 1600 to 1300 BC. Johan Ling.
Thank you very much for this splendid introduction. I see very many colleagues has entered already, and good friends as well. I will now try to share my screen here, if possible. Let's see. It should be this, right? Can everybody see this? No, I did something wrong. Let's try again.
Yeah, good.
Hold on. It's a little tricky. No. A lot of slides. Let's see if I can. All right. Thank you very much for this introduction. And as John said, today's topic on my talk will be Welsh copper in Scandinavian forms. Great Orme's impact on the Scandinavian bronzes 1600 to 1300 BC. And this is based on a major project that we have had ongoing called Scandinavia's Role in the Copper Networks of Bronze Age Europe, 1700 to 1100 BC, founded by the Swedish Riksbank Foundation. And we have in total analyzed 400 objects within this project, but mainly from the phase dated to 1600 to 1100 BC. We have already published some articles showing actually this relation to Great Orme, Lena Melheim, the Danish material, but also an article on swords. But now we have some new interpretation of later phases actually, and can show also that it's not only the earlier phase that we have stressed before, but also our period 2, that is 1500 to 1300 BC, where we seem that also seems Great Orme seems to have been of importance then. Regarding the connections between Bronze Age, between Scandinavia and the British Isles in the Bronze Age in terms of metal, this has been stressed for a long time. First of all, we have the works based on typology of metals. We have Montelius stressing that, Butler, Vankilde, but also Needham. But then we have later studies that has based more on analytical data of metal signature as well as typology. I mentioned Melheim et al. Study 2018, also the study of what I'm in and Allen, but also a new fresh study by Nørgaard et al. Here I'm showing the map from their study, where they focus on 2000 to 700 to 1700 BC. And also Williams' work then, which I will come back to on Great Orme. But going back a little to this Nørgaard study, focusing on early Bronze Age, about 2000 to 1700 BC, they can show that some of the Scandinavian artifacts from this phase match with the ore data from both Wales, Great Orme to some extent, but foremost to Aldrey Edge then, and have then also argue for the interconnection between these regions, also in terms of Central Europe, and also in terms of tin and Baltic amber then. However, we are then focused on later phases than this study. So I won't go into detail in this study then, which I can highly recommend to read. I just want to stress that we hadn't been able to make these connections without Alan Williams' very influential and systematic work on Great Orme during later phases here. What he can show that Great Orme has much more higher impurities than you thought before, and that you can actually match much more metals in terms specifically on the British Isles to Great Orme, and made very thorough interdisciplinary work where he had defined and characterized the ores, both in terms of geochemical but also isotopic data. Also showing that probably Great Orme was most active between 1600 to 1400 BC, the boom as he stressed, and question the theory that it's been a seasonal small-scale production rather during this phase than a more big-time production between 1600 to 1400 BC. I can highly recommend you to read Alan's work, and I will come back to those later here. But to put this in a picture, we have to speak a little about the Bronze Age as a whole. Most scholars today argue that the shift from Neolithic to the Bronze Age was a profound structural transformation based on a change in political economy. And that you had actually societies investing in long distance exchange as ever before, that demanded different and other forms for social organizations and social institutions than before. And that large scales in metals and other commodity developed in a different range. And maritime river and trade in metal created radically longer and more complex chains. And then control of long distance exchange, here specifically control of boats and crew, was a fundamental feature for the development of social complexity, we argue, or rank society or chiefdom-like. We also argue that we have regional comparative advantages that emerge that offered opportunities for control by emerging elites during this phase. And here is like a model on this comparative advantage that we think emerged in the Bronze Age, and that encourage the development of macro-regional trade. That specific regions had specific things that they focused on in terms of both production, distribution, and consumption. That in the north we have our Mona Lisa, Baltic amber, In the west, on the British Isles, tin, copper, gold. Spain, Iberia, copper, silver. Central Europe, copper, salt, etc., etc. And that this was also an important prerequisite conditions for trade and interaction then. And as I said before, Bronze Age elites benefit from controlling bottlenecks of production and exchange and consumption during this phase. That you have regional comparative advantage on copper, silver, amber, fur, or tin, gold, jet, wool, and that you can control this production by controlling specifically maybe copper smelting, boats, crew, warrior, transport, and technology then. Another important feature for the connectivity during this phase was not the least the spread of standardized tin bronze, spreading from the British Isles, connecting to the north, to Scandinavia, Central Europe, but also to the south, to Iberia then, which also is an important feature to understand the trade and the interaction during the Bronze Age then. We have also the development of boat technologies, new boat technologies, and new maritime institutions. We all know about the plank-built boats that starts to occur on the British Isles about 2000 and onwards. Here is John Koch's splendid map showing the crisscross here is the findings of these plank-built boats. These boats demanded tin bronze, actually sufficient access to make planks. And we have also in Scandinavia during this phase, not as early finds of plank-built boats later, but although we have very many rock art that points to that we have developed this or somewhat later developed this technique in Scandinavia then. In terms of Scandinavia, we argue that we have the development of boat technology, a new maritime institution about maybe 1700, 1600 BC to about 1500 BC and onwards. And the evidence for this and the output for this is all the ship and boat iconography we have in Scandinavia. 20,000 boats have been depicted on the rocks during this phase in Scandinavia. Here I have denoted the rock art areas with boats then. But also you have ship-shaped graves, ship setting as we call them, and also ships on bronzes, showing that this production, this maritime technology and these maritime institution ended up in these more ideological features in terms of graves, but also rock art. We argue then that in terms of political economy and modes of production, that the particular Nordic form of political social organization that emerged in the Bronze Age, we call it the maritime mode of production, became established then. And it gave rise to a prominent involvement of Nordic groups in long distance exchange. And this mode of production was based on control of trade by owning boats and financing long distance maritime exchange with surplus gained from farmsteads, but also probably of unfree labor. And this was realized by the fusion of two major economical key sectors, or as we call forces of productions. A land-based agrarian sector where ownership of large intensified farms that produce surplus, and then that you invested this surplus in the sea-based sectors, in seaworthy boats with crews that realize and control long-distance exchange. Because Scandinavia during this phase attracts a lot of metal, and therefore it demanded a totally different social organization than before. Then when it comes to aspects of trade and how we can look at trade in the Bronze Age, we can say that we have two major paradigms that are competing. One that stresses elite control, long distance exchange network, another that emphasizes smaller scale local trade, down the line trade, etc., etc. we probably have both. We can't deny that. But on the other hand, new analyses show that we have underestimated long distance exchange severely during the Bronze Age. I mean, we have new analyses of DNA, lead isotopes, strontium isotopes, analysis of glass beads and Baltic amber, and also rock art that shows that we have totally underestimated long distance exchange in the Bronze Age than before. Now, with this short background, I will enter more of the topic here, the evidence of prehistoric mining, and which is the main focus for this talk then. But here is a map, as you see from Will O'Brien's splendid work, showing radiocarbon dated mines out in Bronze Age in Europe then. And as you see in this picture, there's no mines in Scandinavia, not in northern Germany, not in Poland, not in the Baltic. And the closest mines we have is either Central Europe, Slovak, Austria, Italian Alps, or the British Isles, as you see here. Taking a look at production and consumption of copper at the British Isles, here I use Alan Williams' splendid graph of that, showing that you have different sources during different phases. In the beginning, you have Ross Island, and then Paris Mountain, this name I can't spell, but all Edge. And then you have Great Orme, taken over about 1600 BC to about 1400 BC. And then you have a continental stock of metal coming in and replaces somewhat of the activity at Great Orme then. I can't see myself lower on the, but okay, I have to work it anyway. Regarding the Great Orme mine in Wales, now again, using Alan's splendid work here, that new evidence strongly suggests that Great Orme's copper mine had a golden age of major production, 1600 to 1400 BC, constituting Britain's first mining boom, and that it dominated to about 1400 to 1300 BC. Interesting enough, he argued that you maybe have produced up against 800 tonnage from about 1700 to 900 BC. But the main part of this production is between 1600 to 1400 BC, where he argued that you have maybe 4 tonnage per year or 2 centuries, and equivalent to about 2,200 or 9,000 palstaves, which is indeed interesting. Here also shows some palstaves from Höne, shield ornamented, which will come back to. Sorry. Here's also Alan's work showing that the output then, not in detail, but that you have both in terms of lead isotopes, but also mainly the chemical data show that very much of Acton Park work is consistent with Great Orme, totally dominating probably. Also to some extent Ayrton and Taunton, and also to the left the probable spread of the Great Orme metal in terms of palstaves then on the British Isles. But you have also a spread beyond the British Isles of this. In France, where you have both lead isotopes, the geochemical data showing, in Belgium, in Holland, and also, as you see here, Höne. And this is just outside Gothenburg. We sampled these 2 artifacts, or maybe it's one, to be honest. And these are typical shield ornamented artifacts. And we argue in the early stage, when we didn't have the signature for Great Orme, that it should be East Aegean ores or Lavrion. But that has been now corrected by Alan Williams, thank God, which is far more logical in terms of both typology and also geography and trade routes then. What about the consumption of metal in Bronze Age Scandinavia then? Well, we consume a lot of metal. From Bronze Age Scandinavia, we have found 20,000 objects ranging from 1700 to 500 BC. And during a certain phase, we have actually the largest ensemble of swords in entire bronze in Europe. About 2,000 swords has been recorded in Scandinavia, mostly from Denmark, but also we have also in northern Germany, we should stress. And so the outcome of this is that we have a very large consumption. And Christian and other colleagues had argued that you maybe consume about 1 to 4 tonnage on yearly basis during between 1600 and 1000 BC, and maybe 1,600 tonnage during the entire Bronze Age, which is actually logical in terms of what we find and how much artifact. It should be also argued that very much of the Scandinavian artifacts has high tin content. It's not only copper, but also high tin content, as for these swords that I show here, up against 10%, average 8 to 12. Going back then to the projects that I mentioned in the beginning, it's like 4 interrelated projects where we have trying to provenance about 400 objects to see where all this metal is coming from. And this is from both archaeological well-dated hoards and burials, and in addition 450 European samples. And it's a very time-consuming work. We are successively interpreting phase after phase, and we're now down to period 3, about 1500 to 1300 BC. At a very early stage, we could show that none of our artifacts match the copper ores that we have in Scandinavia. We have actually very much copper in Scandinavia. And that was actually my first theory, but it was falsified by analyze after analyze. The Scandinavian ores are very indeed old, and up against 2 billion years, between 1 to 2 billion years, while the signatures on our artifacts range between 300 to 600 million years, indicating more continental ores than. Maybe I can do like this with this. Oh, good. Just short showing that we could show in terms of lead isotopes then that we have a clear chronological variation in signatures and origin. From the earlier phases, we have a larger spread. And then when we come to the Middle Bronze Age, we have more confined spread, specifically in period 3 here you can see, and in period 4, but then you start also to get a larger spread in period 5. This is also the same thing in terms of geochemical data, where you can actually show also the ore types, where we go from the beginning of the phase, more higher impurities, then to lower impurities in the Middle Bronze Age, and then back to higher impurities in the Late Bronze Age then. Here is showing all the lead isotopes plotted out and potential sources then that we can see. For instance, here's Great Orme, here's Slovak, and here's also Mitterberg, here's Italian Alps, and here's Iberia then. And isotopes is good in one way, but you also, it's very important to use geochemical data to verify or falsify these potential origins of the metal then, which we have done with each and every artifact, I can say. Looking now to the Great Orme, and as I said before, we have earlier matches presented by Nørgaard and Van Kilde, but here we show the latest stuff instead then. The first phase, as we call period 1B, 1600 to 1500 BC, we have actually pretty many matches in terms of lead isotopes with Great Orme. I don't know if you see this ellipse, and the green dots are the Scandinavian artifacts, while the yellow and black are the Great Orme then. And interesting enough, among these artifacts are the famous Distrup hoard, a hoard that scholars have been stressed over and over again, that these swords are typical Haidam's Apa sword, as I showed below, and they must be based on metal from the Carpathian Basin, therefore. However, we can show that these derivates, which they are not real imports. They are rather based on the Great Orme, and which is interesting because that shows that you don't give a damn where the copper come from, only if you get it, and that you can't actually equate ores with typology. You have to check also the content sufficiently. So the old theory that just going for typology doesn't work, even if we can verify it also in other cases. Looking also at the geochemical data, here we are using Alan Williams' graphs here and works, where he has characterized the Great Orme mine with these two ellipses, one with 100% and one with 68% confidence in terms of arsenic and nickel. And here we're looking at our artifact with the same nickel and arsenic, and we're doing the same ellipse. And the yellow then show our artifacts that matches within. And actually, we think, and also in dialogue with Alan, that the one on the right side here is the most potential then, but also on the left side. So you see that's pretty many artifacts also in terms of geochemical data that indicates that the Scandinavian, that we have ores from Great Orme then. So this has been published before to some extent, but we have even more analyses now that I show on this. Before it, we have shown Danish, but now we have also Norwegian and Swedish in this. Sorry, now I'm moving on the wrong ups. But then to period 2, 1500 to 1300 BC, partly Ayrton and it's a Taunton, right? Ayrton and Taunton maybe. This is actually something new that we can show also, that we have artifacts that do match Great Orme during this phase. And probably this is also indicative of dating, that Alan shows that Great Orme is mainly active until 1400 BC. So this could also indicate that this is an early phase of our period 2. Also in terms of the chemical data, here I show in red the plots of period 2. On the right side here you see artifacts, but also very many on the left side. And this is again work that we need to do any more in dialogue with Alan then. We haven't published this yet. In period 3, we don't see anything, and about 1300 to 1100 BC, it doesn't seem like we have any matches with Great Orme anymore, actually. Rather to the Tallinn Alps and maybe Slovak here to some extent, also in terms of the geochemical data, but that is something we're now looking into as well. But this is also in line with Alan Williams' argument that Great Orme then maybe ceased to be a major source about 1400 BC, something like that. And then that you use more continental stock of metal during this phase. This is also the case with the Scandinavian artifacts, where from about 1500 BC, Italian Alps become the main supplier. And then later, about 1300 BC, also Iberia becomes an important supplier. But we also argue that Italian Alps could also be an important supplier for the British ores, for the British artifacts during this time. Here we have made plots of British swords dated to 1400 to 1200 BC, and very many of these match the Italian Alps then. So it might be so that this was also an important source for for the British Isles in this phase. So summing up some here, in terms of the Scandinavian material, we can see some trends in suppliers of copper. During the 1600th century, the Great Orme mine in Wales, also the Mitterberg mines in Austria, as well as the mines in Slovak constituted the major copper sources. About 1500 BC, the mines in Italian Alps became a major supplier, but we still have, as we have shown now, also Great Orme is still there, and also to some extent Slovak and Austria. Around 14 to 1300 BC, the Italian Alps are still a very dominant supplier, but here also comes Iberia, which I will talk about later maybe. Another issue that I haven't stressed here though is, but what about the tin? Tin, as I show here on this map, very tentatively, we have it in Iberia, on Brittany, on Cornish tin, Devon, and British Isles, in Erzgebirge. And also the Scandinavian artifact has a high tin content. Therefore, this is something we have to have in the model as well. And specifically knowing when so many of the Scandinavian artifacts has so high tin content, from about 1600 BC and onwards, we are depending on tin. And in fact, we have analyzed tin ingot in Sweden, although dated to the late Bronze Age, about 1000 BC, that do match. Here in green is the signature of these of this tin ingots, and in yellow are ores from Cornwall. As you can see, that this tin ingot then matches the Cornish ores, which is not surprising when we have other studies, as for Panichka and their works, and also pointed to the importance of Cornish ore in the Bronze Age. And then not the least the Salcombe wreck that we desperately wait for the analysis, and not the least lead isotopes on. But I hope Alan will solve that for us as well. We think that during this phase, about 1600, 1300 BC, and maybe later, about 1400 to 1300 BC, we have a triangular trade where the Nordic trader acted as middleman, where actually Baltic amber is exchanged against copper, maybe and here in Central Europe with the tumulus culture that has strong trade relation with Italian Alps. And then copper is traded also with tin and copper here on the British Isles. And it goes round and round like this, you can say. But that could be one model that we argue for during this phase, but also then the importance of Baltic amber, that in the early phase you have it on the British Isles, then later in Central Europe and specifically in the tumulus culture then. Later, when we have this shifting in ore supplies, about 1300 BC, we think we have two major systems here that provide copper to Scandinavia. And that is this north-south going axis with Central Europe and also North Sea with the British Isles, Scandinavia, and southern tumulus culture. And then also we have the Atlantic culture, the Atlantic system coming in later on about 1300 BC, which also could have produced tin, but we argue that probably most of the tin came from Cornwall then. Another key thing is that's been stressed. I mean, we are speaking about the copper coming to Scandinavia all the time. Are we active or passive receivers of metals? And this, we think actually that the Scandinavians are rather active in this system. Classical for chiefdoms or chiefdom-like societies is actually to control trade, to go as far as possible with their boats. Otherwise, you have no control whatsoever on trade. Looking at the picture also we have in Scandinavian Bronze Age, you could make analogies with the Viking Age in terms of silver. We have the largest hoards of silver in Scandinavia and during the Viking Age, but you don't extract the silver. the Vikings went actively to the ports where there were silver. And we think that not in the same scale and manner, but we think in a way also in the Bronze Age you are active and you go and push as far as long as you can. Not the least evident with the rock art boats, and here what I show with swords from this phase. But how far could we have traveled with the boats then? We have in Scandinavia, we have the Hjortspring boat, dated to transition to early Iron Age, but most scholars argue that this boat has a long history. It doesn't evolve just in the Iron Age, and it's indeed very similar to the rock art boats that we also find in the earlier phase of the Bronze Age. And this boat then, you can actually has a very strong interest in capacity. With trained paddlers, you can hold about average speeds of 3 to 4 knots and cover a daily distance up to 80 to 100 kilometers. And you can actually load it, except of crew, with 700 to 100 kilos for trade goods. Using this boat, and also with the aid of what we call software for modeling ancient seafaring, you could actually reach the British Isles in a day with very good weather and with trained paddlers. Not in a day, but I mean in a summer with good weather, about 13 to 15 days. If you paddle 8 hours a day, alternate the paddling, and then you sleep 8 hours and then you paddle again. Actually, the ones that made this experiment with the Hjortspring boats were trained Olympic paddlers from Denmark that took it up almost to 80 kilometers a day. And they said that give us a month and we will take it 100 kilometers. So we shouldn't underestimate how far you actually can push these boats. Oops, here I will just also show a short movie of this boat, Hjortspring. Here's Olympic paddlers then pushing it forward. And they maximize it to 8 knots. You couldn't hold that for very long, but 3 to 4 knots an average distance then. How many boatloads with metal then, yearly boatloads of metal could have gone from UK to Scandinavia if we model this then? If we have, as Alan said, Great Orme, 4 tonnage per year over 2 centuries, 1600 to 1400 BC, and we know that Scandinavia demanded 2 to 4 tonnage yearly consumption during this phase, how many boatloads would have gone to the British Isles then? If you have 4 boatloads, you could have with 250 kilo, you can of course have one in one boat, but that it's not very probable. Rather that you divide it on more boats on 250 kilo, maybe 100 kilo, or 10 or 20 kilos. That means that you have fleets going each season to, for instance, British Isles, but also northern Germany and other places to meet where you have metal networks then. And this is exactly also what we see on the rock art, fleets with boats during this phase, where you seems to invest in this maritime forces of production. And you don't do these boats after the Bronze Age. You only do these boats when you import copper and tin from other parts of Europe then. So in a way, we can see the Norsemen's activity as an analogy. Of course, the Norsemen had a much more driven sailing technology, much more driven boats. It was in a different scale. But as I argued before, we think the Scandinavians were very active in this system and try to push these boats as far as possible in order to obtain the metal. I don't know how long time I have spent now, but I think it's people are getting exhausted here, and I think there's very many questions as well. But I will try to wrap this up. So I will try to conclude here. The preliminary interpretation that I've showed here require more work, and not least with input from Alan Williams. But still, these results point to the fact that Great Orme was a significant source for the Scandinavian bronzes from about 1600 to 1400 BC. And we think actually we can find even more material when we do these deep studies then. Nørgaard et al. Study shows a similar pattern for earlier phases, although it was rather few bronzes or metals, but also points to other sources in UK and than just Great Orme. We argue that amber may have been one of the goods that the Scandinavian used to exchange for copper, but also that you used tin. The tin was important for the Scandinavians, so to speak. And we argue that the Nordic groups were highly active in this exchange, largely due to its maritime social organization and institution that stimulated activities directed to the long-distance exchange of metal. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Johan. That's a fascinating paper and a fascinating topic, and very strongly argued. And you've brought in a work as well from people who have come to the seminar this evening. Well, first of all, I'd like to ask John to give a brief response to your paper before we open up the floor to questions, and no doubt there'll be many questions. So if you're familiar with the hand-raising function of Zoom, then please feel free to use that. Other than that, I'll try and keep a watchful eye to see if I can see people actually physically raising a hand to make a point or to ask a question.
Well, thank you, Ellen, and thank you so much, Johan. I mean, that was a very rich paper, and I know since we've been working together on some of these subjects that it's you know, you've just scratched the surface with many of the things you talked about, but there is sort of an emerging picture coming together from all of these diverse pieces, and including, you know, where the metal is coming from and at different periods, the evidence for maritime technology and long distance trade and so on. It's truly fascinating and with wide ranging implications, and not just for the Bronze Age and not just for archaeology. And one of the things in particular that you touched on that maybe you could give us a little more information about now is the connections longer distance than from Great Orme to Scandinavia, stretching all the way down to the Iberian Peninsula, another metal-rich area with a lot of a Bronze Age activity, which seems to come in at a later period. And I'm wondering if, and I know there's more evidence, it's something we looked at the beginning of our project two years ago, and that there was more to find with it. And I also know there's some newer material, and maybe you can talk a little more about that now.
Yes, I mean, Iberia has been underestimated in this picture, and especially in the world system. It's been kept out, or very strange, which is strange due to it has not only Europe, but one of the world's largest concentration of sulfide ore and also tin. And so therefore, it's not surprising that we have matching that isotopes, but also, in fact, the chemical signatures. It's low impurity ores with the artifacts in Scandinavia. But we also argue that this is also probably the case with some of the British artifacts in these later phases that Alan is showing, the continental, that we need to look in more sufficient to. But Iberia is a strong potential source from about 1300 BC, even a little earlier. We start to also to get it 1400, some artifacts from 1500 BC as well. And I'm not surprised for that at all. It's just these old conventions with Central Europe and the British Isles and the Carpathian basins that people are stuck in, which I think it's rather strange. But I have some slides about that, but I don't know if it's proper to show it now. But maybe we should just discuss as it is. I can, although I had the feeling that this would come.
Yeah, so why don't you?
First of all, I just want to stress that you could travel with these boats all the way down to Iberia. You think, no, you can't. They are too fragile. And no, you can't do it. If you look at the Haida groups, they had boats of similar types, although they are made in a log, but they have the same size, the same width. And the Haida groups went 3,000 kilometers each season with a boat with the same size. So you can push a boat like this if you have the knowledge all the way down. And I think we should also think about that in the end. Although here also it's another slide showing where we have played some with the British artifacts dated to 1400 to 900 BC. This is Sophia's work then, and showing that you have actually very many artifacts that tentatively could match the Iberian sources also on the British Isles from this phase. That somebody needs to look into more in detail, somebody like Alan Williams or other persons. So we think that Iberia is clearly underestimated in this system then. And I also have, let's see, maybe I had, well, let's talk instead. Maybe.
Well, thank you, John and Johan. Would any of the people whose work has been cited here, would anybody like to contribute a comment on Johan's talk? If you would like to open your mics. I'm trying to look around. Alan, have you opened your mic?
Yes, well, thank you very much, Johan. That was great talk. Really enjoyed that. And it's great that the whole network is gradually unraveling. One question for you. Is the amount of amber in the archaeological record enough to account for this trade, or do you think that other goods besides amber were equally important?
Well, I think that's a one commodity, so I don't think you can use it as a main. I mean, the main thing but it's one thing we can show. One of the few things we can show. But I mean, that's also comes to how you valued amber. I mean, Christiansen argued that you have valued amber in at the same rate as gold. If you do that, you can then it becomes important. But I don't think, and we don't think it's the only commodity here. We think also we should stress fur. We should not the least stress unfree labor, slaves. And that, I mean, I think the evidence from Tannet could indicate that you actually have, where you have Scandinavian signatures, where you have signatures from the West Mediterranean, also in the British Isles. In all cultures like this, unfree laborers are really important in trade and exchange and interaction. And also I'm thinking about the Great Orme. I mean, the ones that maybe produce copper here could also be unfree labor. So this is also something we have to have in the picture. I remember we had a great conference, Trade Before Civilization, in Gothenburg for about 3-4 years ago with these high-profile anthropologists, Timothy Earle and Brian Hayden. And we had presented all scholars from, both from Neolithic and the Bronze Age, the gold, the trade with amber, with trade with copper. But they said, what about unfree labor? What about slaves? All their experience of societies on this level, or if you call it ranked society, chiefdom-like level, unfair labor is key importance. So I think that should also be something we could have in the picture, although then very hard to put in evidence. But I think maybe some of the traces there on Thanet could point to that direction, where you have a female with Scandinavian signature, also a child, if I don't misremember, from although in the late Bronze Age. So I think boatloads, not only with metal, but also boatloads with people are being transferred.
Thank you.
I
Yes?
can see a
Hello?
hand. Yeah, Simon.
Hello, yeah. Hello. So, sorry, I don't think my name came up, but I'm Simon Timberlake. So, I'm the archaeologist who's working on a site that Johan couldn't pronounce. But yeah, so I really enjoyed your talk, Johan. Thank you. So the question I was going to ask is, obviously the evidence is very convincing that Great Orme copper, and indeed possibly copper from some of the other sites, is going to Scandinavia. But I think Alan's map is very useful when we look at the shield palstave, which is sort of the characteristic Acton Park product, if you like, that is appearing all over, particularly around the coastal edges of Western Europe. And I think you gave examples of the Gotland, the one that came from Gotland. But I'm just wondering how many of these palstaves have been recognized in Scandinavia, and if so, whether they are actually functioning as ingots.
Yeah.
So it's the actual palstaves which are going, and obviously they're being melted down, but I'm wondering why perhaps that not more palstaves have been found in the Scandinavian countries compared to some of the other finds in Western Europe, if that was the case.
That's a really important and interesting question, because it also touches upon the issue: is it common as ingots, pure copper, or pure tin, or as it common as a commodity, or as bronze? There's not very many of these shield ornamented palstaves, and not many of the British palstaves. I think, I don't remember now, but maybe 20, maybe 30 as a total. We have tried to pinpoint them down in Sweden, at least. I don't think anybody has done it in Denmark. Although Butler made back then, 63, sufficient work on it. But I think actually that parts coming as ingots in terms of palstaves, but also parts as pure copper and pure tin, because what we find in Scandinavia also is pure droplets of tin in crucibles, actually from our period through 1500 to 1300 BC, and also we find pure droplets of copper, which indicate that in parallel to maybe axe ingots, you also have pure copper ingots and pure tin ingots. Also, we have considerable, very many palstaves. How do you pronounce that? Palstaves or
palstaves?
Yeah. Very many Scandinavian palstaves, so to speak. Unfinished raw products, but the interesting thing is we have very few pure ingots of copper found in Scandinavia, and even less tin. So it's kind of an enigma here that we are wrestling with. Where are you then, or are you? My theory is that in Scandinavia you consume so much metal, so when it comes in as ingots, you kind of cast it directly, and you make it into your own domestic commodity with your own palstav that is traded within Scandinavia. Also due to the fact that trade is controlled by elites, we think. And if you control the copper trade, you want to get this out in the system in Scandinavia. You want to have it spread out to each and every farmstead. and therefore you probably put your own brand on it in terms of taking these British paddle staves and turn them into Scandinavian paddle staff types. It's one idea then. But it's a very interesting question, and we've been discussing it back and forth in terms of ingots, raw ingots of copper and tin. So
yeah, I'm just wondering if separate ingots of copper and also small ingots of tin are going, you would have perhaps expect you would get less consistency in bronze composition. But if, for instance, axes or some other object is going, which is then melted down and turned into a local product, you might have a more consistent composition. But yeah, so perhaps that's something which will come out when this work, all of the analyses are done.
Yeah, but that's a question I will take with me. But we are trying to discuss this within the team as much as possible. So thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Are there, I saw somebody called, I saw Timothy. I saw your hand up earlier. Would you like to make a comment or ask a question?
Yeah, so I'm Tim Earle.
Hello.
My name has been used correctly. I'm particularly interested in the ethnographic comparisons. And it's important when we talk about the comparative advantage that Johan raised. And he emphasized amber, and the question was raised, was amber that important? As a non-Scandinavian, I'm very skeptical. The gold of the North certainly was important in the far South, where it could have obtained increasing value. But there's really no evidence of it being so terribly valuable or heavily exploited in Scandinavia itself. And that's work that I did with Christian particularly. So my feeling is that the comparative advantage is, as Johan clarified, not out of amber, but out of the trading, raiding specialty developed by these maritime chieftains.
Well, I can only agree, Tim. I think also, I think you have exaggerate the importance of the amber, and I think also it's more the comparative advantage is it's like seeing Haida. It's like seeing the Philippine chiefdoms. They hit world systems coming in with the maritime comparative advantage. The Haida group specifically raided the entire coast of America, and they were fierce warriors. They actually call them the Vikings from the West Coast. It's one of the first quotes. But their comparative advantage was boats, social organization that centered around these boats and warriors. And that is very much what we see on the rock art here in the face. Also the evidence in the graves. The Scandinavians are armed to the teeth if you look at the graves. Each and every barrel has a sword or a spear or as I said, with 2,000 swords. So I think that is very much of the comparative advantage, to have warriors, trained warriors, to be able to trade, raid, and intimidate, as you say, Tim.
This is really interesting. I'm certainly not an expert in this area at all, but it just struck me when we were viewing the video of the Olympic paddlers in their very intensive 21st century physique, if you like. How would that physique compare with what you know of the physique of the unfree labor that would have likely been doing that work at the time?
Well, there's not unfree labor paddling the boats. Those are the warriors, those are the athletes, and those are the pride and joy from the farmsteads. And probably, I mean, you were trader, you were warrior, you were artist, and also if we take a look at, I mean, the athletes from this time, we can take Tollens as an example, showing when you have these groups of warriors that are clashing about 1400 BC, that they're very well built. They're almost in my size, so what you put on the boats are the hockey team, so to speak, or the soccer team. That's the one that delivers. The Canadian hockey team would be perfect here. And interesting enough, the best hockey players both in Canada and Sweden, they come from the farmsteads, and which is in line with this highly decentralized mode of production that you have here also. The interesting thing is we have no central places, and there are chiefdoms that are scattered out, and large hamlets and farmsteads, but they are able to organize, and this form of organization is actually the embryo that we then later see in the Viking Age. So in a paper that I published with Tim and Christian, we argue that the first phase of the Viking Age starts in the Bronze Age in a sense. Of course, in a different scale, in a different manner, but all the features that we see in the Viking Age are already at place in the Bronze Age in Scandinavia, more or less.
Fascinating. Alan, are you coming back?
Just a quick comment. How do you see, Johan, the Dover boat and similar boats that have been found in Britain? How do they compare to your Scandinavian boats?
Well, first of all, the technology is derived from that boat. I mean, they are plank-built Zoom boats, right? But it seems like the boards are not as high as a yacht spring, maybe. But on the other hand, what I've seen experiments with them, they seem to work pretty good in open sea as well. I'm not specialist in those boats, though, I have to say, but I think also, I mean, you're highly active with this. The interesting thing, I was actually thinking about that the other day, but it could be that you're learning why you don't see these. I mean, you don't see rock art in the earliest phase in the Bronze Age in Scandinavia. And it could be that then you have boatloads with plank-built boats common from the British Isles with metal. And then you kind of take on that technology, you learn that technology, and then you start to build your own plank-built boats that in the end maybe become as sufficient and even more sufficient. And in the end, I mean, for a phase, the British Isles, you don't need to move. You have everything there. You have copper, tin, and specifically the tin. So you can just wait for the guys coming in, so to speak.
I mean, it's difficult to know, though. I mean, with the Dover boat and similar boats like it.
Yeah.
You know, the British could have done something similar to what you're proposing for the Scandinavians, especially as they've got a lot of tin to trade. Of
course. I mean, they could be as active. I'm not saying that we are the most active, but I'm just trying to explain why we are able to attract so much metal in Scandinavia. But I mean, I think you have maritime chiefdoms also on the British Isles, in Brittany and Iberia, as John has showed in his splendid maps. And all these Atlantic communities are more or less the same in that, but some are basing, I mean, as the Scandinavian, the comparative advantage maybe even more on raiding and trading than others, due to that you have also the tin, you have the copper, you don't have this, maybe you don't need to move in the same manner in that sense. But it's rough speculations.
Yeah, thank you very much. I noticed that Alvaro had his virtual hand up earlier. Was that?
Sure.
Would like to comment, Alvaro?
It's a silly. Thank you, Johan. Very nice talk. Pretty cool. How sure are we that we got good coverage of the mines? So could there be mines that we don't know existed or produced at the time? So and how important would that be if for the type of analysis that you do, like knowing that, well, these are the sources and these are the only sources?
Good question. I mean, and we can take Iberia as a case there. We're actually now excavating a mine there right now that only has been, you have only picked stuff on the surface. We have found 1,000 stone hammers just on the surface. And in Iberia, you have very many potential mines, but also on the British Isles and elsewhere. So the ones that I shown are not all the ones that you have. So they're probably much more. And I mean, Alan can also probably answer up on that even better than me, but they're in terms of, at least in terms of the British Isles. So there are probably much more mines to be found.
And you expect the isotopic signature to vary a lot in space, or are all the mines from a certain region sort of look the same?
Well, you have to sample each and every source. I mean, there could be radiogenic ores, as you say, and that there could be, so you have to be as specific. I mean, otherwise, lead isotopes give a rough signature to a district, right? But here now in Spain, we're actually able to pinpoint it to the mine. As for what Alan has done here with Great Orme, was kind of unique in a sense, but we also have Mittebag and Ross Island where you have been able to do that. But it's otherwise it's just pointing at regions. And I mean, we have in Slovak, you haven't found any sufficient mine yet, but although we have matching isotopes and other things that indicates, and yet very many other regions. I mean, we can take Cyprus, but then later exploitation has removed very much of the mines as well. Somebody argued that maybe what we find is 0.01% of what has, I mean, been produced in terms of in the mines. Maybe that's too low figure, but still it's interesting. It's 3,000, 4,000 years since the Bronze Age. You consume metal, you throw it away, you lose it, and so there were probably much more mines.
Cool. And just a comment on the fitness of the rowers. I think there's a hypothesis to explain the fact that the Polynesians are larger than the Southeast Asian population from which they came from. Hypothesis would be the larger people, and it's very different contexts, migrate, but the sailor that would select sailors that were fitter and larger, especially larger chests, which is, I guess, jive with your idea of very fit rowers. Yeah. They would also paddle, right? They would also paddle.
That's interesting, because that is also very specific for the Haida groups. They were large, indeed were large, and athletic built.
And
you know?
The other thing that size is good for is thermal regulation. So as you're bigger, you mass scales of the cube and area scales of the squared surface area, right? So area scales, if you're bigger, you cool down slower.
Yeah.
And so some people argue that that's also very important for selecting larger people to go out and be exposed to the ocean.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting point.
Cool. Very cool. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I see that Sophia, you would like to make a comment as well.
Yes. Hello. Of course I want to.
I hear you very bad.
Okay. I suppose I'm quite. And is it better now?
Somewhat.
Is it better? Okay, sorry. I have to come closer to my laptop. So I want to comment on the lead isotopes. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah. The question from Alvaro about how much do we know about lead isotopes. I think that generally the geological knowledge of the copper sources, possible copper sources in Europe, is pretty good. So I don't think we are for many surprises when some new sources are concerned. However, what we need desperately is more information about chronology of use of various copper sources. And as Johan said, in Cyprus, for example, it's impossible, practically impossible to find ancient mines, Bronze Age mines. And in many other places like Britain or Spain, most of this evidence have been destroyed. Nevertheless, if we could map very well isotopically and chemically, which is a very weak point in most of the Spanish, for example, copper deposits, then we could link these in the knowledge with the other artifacts and date the copper mining on the basis of the date of the artifacts, which are completely consistent with these characteristics, chemical and isotopic characteristics. So this is, I think, a very important work to do. This is what Alan, again, we're going back to Alan, this is what Alan did in the Great Orme, isotopic and chemical analysis, and then linking it with the artifacts. This is a very important part. Thank you.
I think Nigel is holding
Yeah.
up.
Perhaps I can see that Alan's keen to respond to that comment. So perhaps Alan should go first, and I'll come after.
Oh, well, just a quick comment, really. I think we have to distinguish between small mines that serve the local region. And there's a lot of those, especially in the earlier period. Lots of small mines producing, and we can see that with all the different types of compositions in the early Bronze Age, lots of different sources involved. And that would be the same in all countries that have their own copper deposits. But the number of copper deposits that are large enough to actually satisfy the local region and then have a surplus and a network and a social organization that allows that to be traded over long distances. The number of mines that fulfill that criteria is probably quite limited. And I think we see in the Middle Bronze Age larger mines dominating the supply more. So I think we've got to think of small mines, local regions, larger mines, and them supplying larger regions. And so that simplifies it to a degree. You can never say never, you won't find another big important mine. But I think the way we see these clusters are suggesting that we've probably identified many of the large mines, but there are probably some other sources still to find. Thank you.
Many thanks. Shall we take Nigel's comments or questions now?
Okay, thank you very much. Firstly, I'd just like to congratulate Johan and also many of the other participants here who have been involved in this work in recent years, which from someone who comes at this with an expertise in nautical archaeology is immensely exciting. This really does help to contextualize and raise questions about the archaeological evidence that we do have for maritime transport and maritime networks. And I think it asks of us some very interesting questions, one of which I'd really like to focus on. Inevitably, whenever we try to illustrate these maritime networks, we end up with and please don't take this as a criticism, but inevitably diagrams with the kind of Dad's Army arrows, some of which are vast at that huge strategic level, seeing a kind of a major direction of travel. And others which are more finely grained. I'm thinking here about the map that Johan showed that's based on Alan's work, which might imply, for instance, that alongside marine networks, we also have riverine networks that help us to move from major coastal facades to another. And I think here primarily within the context of this particular talk about how we see transportation from the western seaboard of Britain towards a Scandinavian seaboard, and quite how that transport network operates, whether we are seeing the kind of long distance elite transport networks, the kind of Argonaut idea that might consider long distance trade, as against networks which might have multiple occasions of distribution and redistribution or chain operatoire. And to my mind, this excellent work that's coming from the geochemical and the isotopic work raises questions for those of us trying to envisage these networks. What I would ask is where do we go from here in terms of helping to refine our ideas about how we formulate these networks? Are there going to be archaeological sites that we could see as characterizing this activity, which we might be able to identify in the archaeological record? Clearly, we have huge challenges here across the geographical scope that Johan has talked across. From a nautical archaeological point of view, Scandinavia is something of a disaster during this period, at least, because we're seeing uplift and relatively little preservation of organic materials. And I think that may explain why we see a very different archaeological record in terms of ship remains in northwestern Europe, because they're Britain and Ireland, as against Scandinavia. And yet you have this richness of rock art, and we have always struggled in trying to find fusion between these two different data sets, the direct archaeological evidence that we find in Britain and the Scandinavian material. But nonetheless, we need to formulate at least hypotheses about these different kinds of opportunities for exchange and how those are constituted, and whether we might be able to identify evidence in the archaeological record which allows us to see the points of exchange. And I wondered if, in beginning to identify at least models of the mechanisms that might be involved in this exchange, whether Johan and others have thoughts about how we might actually try to finesse that and try and test what of the many different potentialities for different forms of social exchange and mechanisms for marine transport. How might we try to resolve the interesting questions that arise from this research in looking to the archaeological record? It's a tough question, I know, and I realize that it's not a simple one, but I really do. One part of I would have to say is, in congratulating you, is to say it's this combination of different lines of research that I think are going to be needed to try and push this forward.
Thank you. I mean, I think your question is very important on yet very many levels. We are trying now desperately to work to refine these models. You maybe saw Alvaro here. So one thing that we're doing now is working with this ocean modeling tool that could also give us more data on the distance, on what boat types, and maybe where you stop on the way. Also in relation to archaeological material. So it's a software that we're almost done with, actually, that enables you to take, for instance, a plank-built boat with the speed, and then it's based on data on weather and oceans and what more, Alvaro. Could you come in and fill in maybe?
No, it's pretty much just surface current speeds and wind speeds and type of vessel and navigational capabilities of the vessel. You got it. That's it.
So that's one way, and then correlate that with archaeological sites and records then. Still, I think that, I mean, what you're also aiming at here is the issue about long distance exchange, and you don't go, I mean, you have to stop. You have to, you can't paddle all the way. So, I mean, as for the Haidai, they paddle 8 to 12 hours a day, but they went 3,000 kilometers each season with similar boat types as we are discussing here. more or less. They also had ad hoc sails, which I think also we should take into the picture. And I mean, if you put a sail on these boats, they done it on the yacht spring boat, and it works. It increases the speed from 3 to 4 knots to 7 knots, so to speak. Another line here is, if we're speaking about, you spoke a little about, as I understood, that you have networks, you go shorter distance, you trade, but then you have a problem. Then you have down the line trade, which is highly costly. I mean, again, referring to the Viking Age, they went as far as and pushed as long as they could. Also Haida, the Philippine chiefdoms, because then they can control the trade. They can control the artifacts. Otherwise, it's therefore also, if you see, for instance, you don't have so much artifacts in Holland, in northern Germany, in Poland, as we have in Scandinavia, for instance. You have similar jumps as you have in the Viking Age, which I think indicates that you go and push as far as you can with these boats, although you have to stop. You have to go maybe 8 hours a day, and you have to have transfer points. But I think and also in line very much with Timothy Earle, how he reasons about this, that you actually could try to push and control the trade and go as far as possible with these boats as long as possible.
It's a really compelling argument, I think, isn't it? But certainly don't take my word for it. Do we have any other comments or questions for Johan before we draw this session to a close?
Yeah.
Yes. Oh, great.
Taking your description of the Viking situation, do you think it was always peaceful, or do you think that there might have been a sort of raiding element, as with the Vikings? And is there evidence for settlement, for cross-fertilization of settlement of Scandinavian settlers in North Wales, or vice versa?
The latter question, not that I know of, but on the other hand, of course, they raided as much as possible as they traded, as for the Vikings. And I think that raiding was as important as trading. And again, with reference to the rock art, that's what we see. I mean, that's what you have depicted. They are standing in the boats with raised swords, with raised axes, with raised spears. We have fighting scenes during this phase. So I think that is, in a way, it's like when if I'm really rough here now, I hope you don't, but when the Romans left the British Isles, you have the Anglos and Saxons and Jutish hitting it, right?
Yeah.
What about the phases before the Romans? What about the Bronze Age? Could it be the same situation then, that you have also other groups, as for Scandinavians, or that are also aiming for the metal, aiming for the tin, and that you have really hostile situation actually that we have to take in the picture here?
Thanks, Johan. I'm just slightly concerned. I'm just wondering that we've got a vast database of these rock art boats in Scandinavia, but can we really equate these sort of warrior type boats, that imagery, with in fact the trading boats? Are they the same things? I mean, if you're a maritime nation or peoples, you might be presenting yourself in that sort of competitive warrior way in your rock art, but which obviously implies that you have the ability to trade long distance, but they may not in fact be the same. Those images may not relate to the boats that are involved in the trade.
Well, I mean, I think so, because if you look at the boats and also some of the boats you have very much metal depicted in, and even, these are ideals that you depict on the rocks. You never see, for instance, a farmstead. You never see mundane life. What you see is are these boats and warriors, basically, and a lot of metal. And I showed you, for instance, this with the swords and the boats, that goes hand in hand. So I think, and also what we find in the graves and also depicted on the bronzes from this phase, you have this maritime ideology. But I think that these are maritime warriors, traders, warriors, slash, so to speak, that goes out, and maybe they form a trade, but they also raid and intimidate, and which is typically in line with the models of such societies that we're speaking about. I mean, ranked or chiefdom level societies or decentralized chiefdoms. So I think that's my belief, but I mean, it's hard to put in proof, as you say.
Yeah. So are you saying that the boats that were involved in the trade had warriors with them? Is that what you're saying? Yeah. Oh, yeah. So okay.
That's it. I mean, these are like athletes, warriors, traders, communicators. They had it all, which I think. So it's not peaceful trade. I mean, only cargoes going, but they could fight. They must be able. I mean, it could be conflicting situations, and looking also to. I mean, if we make ethnographic comparisons with, for instance, the Haida, Philippine chiefdoms, or all the Vikings, or other analogies, this is typical what you had on the boats then. And I mean, it's interesting also to see this new thing coming out from the Viking Age research about the DNA now. For a while you said, no, they didn't come so many to the British Isles. They were peaceful traders and farmers, but now the DNA show that they came actually pretty many, and they are verifying this historical accounts, Frankish sources, British sources, Irish sources, more or less how the big impact was in the Viking Age of the groups that were coming over, so to speak. But I mean, analogy couldn't be for too long to the Bronze Age with that. But I think you're pushing and try to go as far as possible with this boats, with warriors, with traders, with raiders on them.
Thank you very much. Is there a final comment or a final question that anybody would like to pose? I think that Johan has worked very hard for his virtual dinner. If you were with us here in Aberystwyth, Johan, we would be taking you out for dinner, but unfortunately it's a virtual dinner only.
How does it taste?
It's excellent. It's excellent. It's even better. It's the best cuisine.
Okay.
But we really would like to be able to welcome you to Wales and to Aberystwyth at some point. We know that a year ago the event had to be cancelled, and so this is why we're having your talk online this evening. But I think that we would all like to show our appreciation to you for a wonderful talk, and also to all who've assisted here at to put this seminar and this talk together, and also to everybody who's made comments and asked questions and contributed to the really vibrant discussion that we've had. But most of all, thanks to you, Johan. Diolch yn fawr iawn. Diolch yn fawr iawn.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
And if you